Hello everyone, my name is Huezo, and today I'll be presenting my research on trauma faced with Indigenous communities. This topic holds an immense significance because of the lasting impacts of historical injustices, such as boarding schools and assimilation practices that are still felt today. These policies were not just harmful, but they're also systematic attempts to erase culture, languages, and identities. My presentation will cover three key areas: the historical injustices that cause these traumas, the ongoing psychological and cultural impacts, and the modern healing practices that Indigenous communities are using to reclaim their identities. Indigenous communities continue to face the consequences of these actions, and through this presentation, I aim to bring a greater awareness to issues and inspire action. To understand the trauma faced by Indigenous communities today, we must first explore how these injustices began. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the US and Canadian governments initiated assimilation policies targeting Indigenous populations. Among the most damaging of these policies were the boarding schools. As the Brinsky 2023 explains, these schools were not educational institutions in the traditional sense, but they were designed to forcefully strip Indigenous children of their cultural identities. Children are removed from their families, often against their parents' will, and are placed in institutions where they are forbidden to speak with their native languages or practice their own traditions. One example of this is the story of Thomas More, a Cree child whose before and after photos from the Canadian boarding school became a haunting symbol of cultural erase. Beyond the schools, there are policies such as forced removal from ancestral lands and outlawing the cultural ceremonies. According to the Equal Justice Incentive 2014, these efforts amounted to cultural genocide, leaving long-lasting scars on individuals and entire communities. Overall, the effects of these policies weren't contained to at least one generation, but also intergenerational trauma, which leads to another generation. Intergenerational trauma refers to the transmission of trauma from one generation to the next, a concept that is especially significant for Indigenous communities. The impacts of boarding schools didn't end with children when they left, but they also left these traumas into adulthood, affecting their parenting and relationships. Ratio at AI 2015 describes how survivors of boarding schools often struggle from feelings of shame, disconnection, and unresolved grief, which were passed down by them as their children. For example, children of survivors frequently grew up in households where emotional expression was stiff due to the parents' unhealed wounds. Brown Rice 2013 points out the cycle that manifests is higher in rates of mental health issues such as depression and anxiety and substance abuse in Indigenous populations today. These issues are not only personal, but they are deeply tied to cultural and historical contexts. Psychological impacts of historical trauma are profound. Indigenous populations experience a disproportionately high rates of PTSD, addiction, and suicide compared to the general population. This was sorted by APA Blogs 2021. But these effects are not solely individual, they ripple outwards to affect entire Native communities. For example, the loss of cultural practices and languages due to boarding schools has created generational gaps in cultural knowledge. Nicola and Sauce 2013 argue that this loss makes it challenging for younger generations to connect with heritage, further potentiating cycles of trauma. Overall, one striking statistic that comes from this is found from First Nations Health Authorities, which reports that Indigenous youth are 6 times more likely to die by suicide than non-Indigenous youth. Overall, this underscores the urgency of addressing these disparities. Healing from these deep wounds require both individual and collective efforts. Indigenous communities are actively working to revitalize their cultural and reconnect with their heritage. Storytelling has become an important tool within this topic. It allows for elders to share their experiences and wisdom with younger generations. One example is found within the Miigwetwe Ore Tribe 2023, which describes storytelling as a way to rebuild cultural identity and strengthen community bonds. Furthermore, traditional ceremonies like smuggling and sweat lodges have also seen a resurgence in communities to reclaim their spiritual practices. One example being language preparation programs, as it's a cornerstone of healing. For example, the Cherokee Nation has launched immersive schools to ensure that their children grow up in fluent native language. Now that I talked about this, I'm going to talk about furthermore into the mental health programs. Overall, the mental health programs are also incorporated in creating a culturally humbler care. As highlighted by the University of Washington Medicine, these programs combine Western therapy and traditional practices to create a hostile approach to healing. Governments play a crucial role in addressing the harm caused by these policies. Truth and reconciliation commissions, such as those in Canada, have provided survivors with a platform to share their stories and demand accountability. Zabriskie 2023 highlights the importance of restoration justice measures, such as formal apologies and reparations in fostering healing. For example, Canada has issued formal apologies for its role in the boarding school system and has allocated funding for survivor support programs. However, there's a critique of these efforts. Rubinson and Clifton, MD, argue that the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions often fail to address systematic issues like poverty and lack of access to healthcare. To create lasting change, governments must go beyond apologies. They must invest in education, healthcare, and cultural preservation incentives that empower Indigenous communities throughout the globe. Some critics, like Robinson, question the emphasis on trauma, arguing that it risks overshadowing Indigenous resilience and strength. While this perspective is valid, it does not diminish the importance of addressing historical and ongoing harm. Dawn 2023 counters by emphasizing that acknowledging trauma is essential for achieving mental health equity by addressing both trauma, resilience. Indigenous communities can reclaim their identities and build stronger futures. In conclusion, the trauma faced by Indigenous communities, from boarding schools to assure their cultural identities, has left deep lasting scars. However, through cultural revitalization, mental health incentives, and governmental accountability, Indigenous communities are working tirelessly to heal. As someone who is a non-Indigenous person, I believe it's our collective responsibility to showcase these voices and supports for these efforts. If we fail to act, we're risk showcasing these cycles of trauma and injustices again within future generations. Thanks for understanding my podcast, and thanks for listening. I hope this presentation has deepened your knowledge and understanding of these critical issues. I hope you make action and understand this more deeply. Thank you.